Hello, I'm Cheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York. Welcome to One to One. New York City is rich in museums, from the high art of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, to the risque quirkiness of the Museum of Sex, to the rustic Brooklyn setting of the Weeksville Heritage Center, the site of one of the country's first free Black communities. But none of them are more unique than the Lower East Side Tenement Museum. Located in two original tenement buildings dating back to the turn of the 20th century, it has reconstructed the apartments where actual immigrant families lived. It educates us about the lives they lived there, their work, their struggles, their triumphs and tragedies. Few places honor the past of the truly poor and allow us to see it as it actually was. I'm delighted to welcome Miriam Bader, the museum's Director of Education. Welcome.
Thank you.
In my view, the Tenement Museum is one of the most fascinating places in New York City because it actually takes you to where immigrants were living around the turn of the century and how they were living. How did the museum come about?
So the museum was founded in 1988 by two amazing women, Ruth Abram and Anita Jacobson. And when they looked around the United States and they looked at all of the different historic sites we have, they noticed that there was almost no sites that told the story of ordinary people. Most were of very wealthy men, presidents, or of sites where important wars were fought. But there were very few spaces that told the story of ordinary people, people like you and me, and how they ended up shaping America. And really, from that idea, they decided it was time to found a museum who could be more ordinary than immigrants, and who could be more central to this country's story.
So somebody had to buy this building or receive this. Who bought it? Who financed it?
So the museum is founded in 1988, and I believe it's not until 1996 that we actually purchased the building.
Okay.
And the museum is part of the National Park Service, as well as part of the National Historic Trust. And so it's now considered significant to America's national story.
Okay.
And funds from those places, as well as others, would have helped us to make the initial purchase.
So we're talking about 97 Orchard Street and 103 Orchard Street. 97 Orchard Street, which is currently the center of most of your exhibits and tours, was occupied from 1863 to 1935. And I understand a total of 7,000 people lived there over the years.
It's pretty incredible when you think about that. 7,000 people all in one building. They came from over 20 different nations, all of them here to start their lives.
At one point, the Lower East Side was the most, I understand, according to your website, was the most crowded neighborhood in the world. Why did the new immigrants go there as opposed to concentrate there as opposed to other parts of the city?
Yeah, by 1900, most people, or some people would say that the neighborhood was so densely populated that it was the most crowded place on earth. So many immigrants were choosing that neighborhood to make their home. But New York City and the Lower East Side have always been gateways for immigrants coming into this country. And of course, once one community creates a home there, then there begins to be resources and reasons for other people to come there. There was also great jobs in terms of the garment industry. And so it was a location that both had access to work as well as access to people that probably spoke your same language and could understand some of the experiences you were going through.
Was 97 Orchard Street typical of the kind of housing that immigrants found when they came here, and what were the characteristics of that housing?
It's typical working class housing. And really, like today, there's a housing crisis in New York City, and that was true in the past. And originally in the Lower East Side, there would have been many single-family row houses. But as more and more immigrants came needing homes, tenements were designed to actually be a solution so that every family could have their own space, which in a multifamily dwelling. And tenement is really just another word for an apartment. But over the years, it's grown to have a reputation of being...
It started out as a reform.
Yes.
Wound up being something kind of scabrous.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Right. Yeah.
What was life like for the residents of 97 Orchard Street?
When the building first opens in 1863, there's no running water in the building, there's no electricity, and so one's daily life is going to be occupied with a lot more of those tasks that relate to that. But by 1905, when running water comes into building, that's going to really change the experience of the immigrants that are living inside.
Right.
As of course will be the crowding, and so at different points of time, right, the amount of people living in the building will change.
What impressed me when I took some of the tours there, was how small the apartments were, how many people lived in each apartment. And you'd have, maybe in a one bedroom, you'd have families and you'd have boarders. How dark the rooms and hallways were, how little privacy. In one room, a woman might be giving birth, while in the next room, 4 or 5 garment workers would be turning out piecework. And one really comes away from the museum realizing that the glorious land of opportunity that these immigrants thought they were coming to turned out to be often offered miserable living conditions, miserable working conditions, miserable health conditions, and it was a very long slog to achieving the kind of minimally comfortable life that they were seeking.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would often make a difference what someone's perspective actually was, where they had come from, how they would see what the benefits that 97 Orchard Street provided was. For many of our visitors coming, New Yorkers look at these 325 square foot apartments, 3 rooms, and they go, oh, this is so much space. This is great for New York, right? And then we'll have tourists come from out of town, and they will have the feeling that you just described. How is it possible that as many as 12 people could have shared this space and lived so closely to 3 other families and then shared toilets with them? And so a lot depends on your vantage and the lens from which you're coming from.
The museum has restored 6 apartments to this point, right?
I believe so.
Okay. The 1870s German salon of John and Caroline Snyder.
Yeah, so when the building was first built in 1863, the Lower East Side was Kleindeutschland. It was Little Germany. And both John and Caroline were immigrants that came from what would eventually become part of Germany. And they create a saloon right in the basement of the building.
It was a saloon, not a salon.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And what's amazing is that it's one of 500 saloons in the neighborhood. So there were quite a few places to go and get a drink. And because people's apartments were so small, in many ways, these commercial spaces, these shops in the basements of these tenement buildings became living rooms for the community. And their place certainly would have been like that.
Okay. Then you have the Levine family. They ran what was really a sweatshop in the apartment. And I guess that same apartment became the Rogarszewski's Sabbath table at the turn of the century.
Yeah, so both of those 2 families, the Levine family and the Rogarszewski family, are featured on our tour called Sweatshop Workers, which really looks at the experience of what it's like to be working in sweatshop condition, and also how your work can impact your family life and your cultural life. Harris and Jenny Levine come from Plonsk, Poland. They're living in the building in 1897, and Harris is running a dress shop right inside of his living room. He's working as the sewing machine operator, but he would have hired 3 other workers that are working there right alongside, right, his wife and his little children, who are also living inside of this home. But things begin to change over time, and people begin to ask questions. Is it acceptable to have your working place at home? Is it okay to have so many people working in such small conditions? And ultimately, reforms begin to come that take many of these sweatshops and garment shops out of people's tenement apartments and into much larger loft facilities. And that's the experience that the Rogarszewski family is going to find themselves in. They are living in the building by 1910, and many of their 6 children are working in different aspects of the garment industry, but many of them are working in those larger factories that we might imagine when we hear the word sweatshop.
Okay. The home of the German-Jewish Gumpertz family, whose patriarch disappeared during the Panic of 1873. And I guess the Italian Catholic Baldizzis also lived here during the Great Depression.
Yeah, so each of our tours will often showcase the story of 1 or 2 different families that lived in the building at a different point in time and explore connections across time and space.
They have necessarily lived in that same apartment?
So not in that exact same apartment,
Okay.
but you get to see both of their apartments. So on our Hard Times tour, you can hear the story of Natalie Gumpertz, who's living in the building during the Panic of 1873, tough economic times. As you mentioned, she's abandoned by her husband, he disappears, and she has to figure out how to take care of her 4 young children. And her story on that same tour is complemented by the story of the Baldizzi family, a Sicilian Catholic family that's living in the building in the 1930s, also during a time of Great Depression. And it's that juxtaposition of looking at different families at different time periods, different cultures, that also lets us begin to see some of these larger trends and what is universal about what some of these different immigrant families experienced.
What are some of the things that are universal about what they experienced, in your view?
You know, I think for both the Gumpertz family and the Baldizzi family, there are all sorts of questions of who do you turn to in times of need? You know, both of those families struggled, but each of them had different assets. I mean, they both have their community, they both have their religious institutions, but the Baldizzi has government, right? And the New Deal and policies that are going to help support them in ways that didn't exist in the 1870s.
Right.
And so you can begin to really look at questions about who is responsible to help, right? What rights are people entitled to? If you don't have a job, who should help you?
Right.
And those become, right, those are questions that we still think about today.
Right. And we have the home of the Moores, an Irish Catholic. They were Irish Catholic immigrants who left the Five Points area. Where was the Five Points area?
So the Five Points area is right around where the courts are in Lower Manhattan.
Okay.
There's actually Columbus Park is right where the original 5 Points are. Although I think I read an article recently that there's going to be a new plaque and monument.
Okay, and
to
that
the
was a
5
notorious
Points.
area, like gangs of New York, supposedly.
Yeah, slums, Irish slums.
Right. And this Irish Catholic family moved into what was at the time a largely Jewish
It was
neighborhood.
largely German.
German,
and very
okay.
much mixed. There certainly would have been Jewish Germans there, but there were also have been Lutherans like the Schneiders who were running that saloon at the same time in the basement of the building. But they were one of only 2 Irish families living in a predominantly German building. And really that tour thinks about, you know, what is it like to be an insider or an outsider? And how do you become an insider? How do you become American or a hyphenated American or
Right.
an Irish American? And right, we could ask that question about all of the families whose stories we tell, but that story really delves deep into that process of creating an American identity. Thinking about things like the St. Patrick's Day Parade, right? And how do we show our pride, or how are we able, as New Yorkers, able to show where we came from in ways that are acceptable and beloved by New Yorkers.
What did the Moores do for a living? What kind of work?
So Bridget did domestic work. I mean, she took care of her family. She has little girls to take care of, 3 daughters, which are going to keep her very busy. And just thinking about the labor in terms of keeping them clean, doing the laundry at a time when there's no running water, thinking about grocery shopping and cooking for your family at a time when there's no refrigeration. So that is going to keep her very busy. Her husband, Joseph, is working as a waiter. And the two
I wonder
of
if it's
them,
an Irish singing waiter.
you know,
Like-
we do have a fiddle bow in the apartment, and one can certainly imagine him playing that fiddle,
Right.
whether as a waiter or to his daughters to try to get them to go to sleep.
Right, okay. We're going to take a short break, then we'll be back with more with Miriam Bader, Director of Education at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, after this message. Welcome back to One to One. I'm Cheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York, and I'm speaking with Miriam Bader, Director of Education at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum. In addition to your building tours, you also host discussion groups and you have tastings. Tell me about those activities.
Yeah, so we have a few different program series that people can participate in. There's walking tours that let you explore the history of the neighborhood as you walk around. Several different ones. You can take a tour that focuses on the history of buildings and architecture of the Lower East Side. You can take a tour that looks at different visions of the neighborhood called Then and Now, and really think about how the neighborhood has changed over time. And there's even a food walking tour called Foods of the Lower East Side. Of course, food is an excellent way for people to learn. And food is one of the gifts that the immigrants have given to all of us, especially in New York, where you can literally eat your way through the city and through the tremendous diverse people that live here and call it their home. And so in addition to the walking tours, there's programs where you can also sit around a table like we are now and have an opportunity to talk to people while you're eating, and have some conversations about what does your favorite food say about you and about your identity? What recipes have been passed down in your family, and what does that say about your history? And what recipes have fallen away? And really thinking about food traditions as a way of learning.
Right. Now, I had Jane Seligman, who wrote about the foods of the Lower East Side back at the turn of the century of the different ethnic groups. She was on here a few years back. I found it really interesting that she found that around the turn of the century, German food was very popular. I guess because among the immigrant groups, the Germans were more well off. They were more prestigious, so people wanted to eat German food. There was very little interest in, say, Italian food or Chinese food or Irish food, because those groups were poor and looked down upon. Whereas today, there are very few German restaurants, but a plethora of Italian and Chinese restaurants. So we see whose food prevailed.
I think what's interesting about the German food too is that so much of it has become American food at some point. I mean, they were here so much earlier than all of those other ethnic groups. Things like pretzels and pickles we don't necessarily think of as German.
Right. You think pickle, you think of pickles as a Jewish thing.
Yeah, but they're bringing it from Germany,
Okay.
or even lager beer, which is the beer that John Schneider would have had in his saloon. You couldn't get lager beer in this country before the Germans came.
Okay.
They opened the breweries.
Okay.
And so it's interesting to also think about, when does something become so absorbed in the culture that you can't even tell?
It's no longer, it didn't disappear, it just became, and stopped being German, it became American.
Yeah.
Very interesting. The museum also owns, well, I said they own 103 Orchard Street. And a couple of years ago, you announced that you're going to be creating new exhibits in that building that will focus on the lives of Chinese immigrants, Jewish Holocaust survivors, and Puerto Ricans who came to the Lower East Side after World War II. And these groups, members of those groups, actually lived in 103 Orchard Street. Okay. When will those exhibits open, and why the decision to focus on those groups?
Sure. So we're hoping 2017, knocking on the wood here, but that's the hope. And really the goal of opening those exhibits is to fulfill the museum's mission, which is to help connect to the present. And because people stopped living in 97 Orchard Street at 1935, we didn't have the opportunity to talk about the newer waves of immigrants that had made their home in this neighborhood after that point. 103 Orchard will really let us do that. We can tell the stories of refugees that came after the Holocaust and made their homes in the neighborhood. We can tell the stories of Puerto Rican migrants, and what their experience was like living in the Lower East Side in the 1950s and 60s. And we can tell the story of Chinese immigrants who really don't come until after 1965, when the laws change, finally allowing them again into this country, and how the neighborhood became one of the largest Chinatowns in North America. And what's amazing is we can tell the story of all three of these very different experiences all in one space and connect them all.
Right.
Because there certainly are connections that all of these different immigrant experiences share.
You have something like more than about 240,000 visitors come to the museum each year. Who are they? I mean, you get a lot of people whose relatives came through the Lower East Side, whose ancestors came through the Lower East Side?
We certainly get people that are looking to connect to the past and see what the experience of their grandparents and where those stories that they've heard passed down through the years came from. But we also get a lot of people who are simply interested in visiting the museum as an attraction. About a third of our visitors are local New York City metro area, a third are the rest of the United States, and then a third are international visitors.
Okay.
And out of that 240,000, 55,000 are school children.
Was it the completion of the subways that started to move people out of the Lower East Side when it started to be less crowded and people could work and live uptown? Was that what sort of changed?
I mean, transportation access is certainly one of the big catalysts for being able to move and be able to be with your family and also be able to get to work. But there would have been other factors too that would have motivated people to leave the Lower East Side, and also new opportunities in terms of construction. I mean, so many of the old tenement buildings in the Lower East Side did not have the same kinds of amenities that were being included in construction that was being built later. And so you could often get better accommodations for your family or more space. When you think of the story of the German immigrants, many of them decide around the 1880s to leave the Lower East Side, 1890s really, and begin to move up to Yorkville on the Upper East Side, because there's so many new immigrant groups moving into the Lower East Side that they still want to have their own little ethnic enclave. And so many groups will also decide to move in response to all of those other factors that are pushing or pulling people throughout the city.
Are there still vestiges of the turn of the century Lower East Side that you can find there today?
You can just walk down the streets. Many of the same buildings are there, like the Lower East Side Tenement Museum at 97 Orchard Street. Lots of the buildings are the same. Of course, the insides of the apartments throughout the neighborhood have been renovated. And you'll find many condominiums as well. But there are certainly vestiges. If you go and look on that, look for them. Take a walking tour and you'll begin to notice things that you pass by all the time.
And you hear about, I guess, sort of the gentrification of the Lower East Side, and I mean, there are certainly different ethnic groups now than there were at the turn of the century. A lot of Latinos. Who else do you find there?
There's a little bit of everything. I mean, the Lower East Side has always been dynamic and is constantly changed in response to the immigrant groups that are there. Come today and you will see a large Dominican presence, you'll see a large Chinese presence especially. So there's certainly lots of different groups, and also smaller pockets of everything else, as well as hipsters, right? Also, I guess, migrants to the neighborhood.
Okay. Now, your educational approach, and this is according to your bio, is based in, quote, constructivism and imaginative education. What does that mean?
I think we learn best by doing. Unlike other museums, when you walk into the Tenement Museum, you're not reading a label. You're experiencing the story through an educator, and you're co-constructing the story of each of those families. And that act of actually holding a primary source, of looking at that census that lists Natalie Gumpert's family, of looking at the court records that proved that her husband abandoned her, all of that kind of active learning, that's constructivist learning. And the imaginative piece comes from being able to actually picture these families. There's something so powerful and intimate about stepping inside someone's home. And suddenly you're not just hearing the story about a person, but you're standing in their kitchen. And you can begin to smell the coal stove, right? And you can begin to see the soot on the walls, and you can begin to feel the ache of the person who's ironing all day long to press the clothing.
The latrine out back or whatever.
Yeah.
Are there other museums in the world that are similar to the Tenement Museum that you can think of?
I mean, I think we're very special, especially because we tell the story of ordinary people and elevate that.
That is a really big difference. I mean, you go to the Met, you're looking at people's clothes and furniture, but it's very rich people for the most part.
Yeah. You know, I think what's so powerful about the museum, especially when I think about the school children who are coming to visit, is that they begin to realize that their homes could be museums too, and that their stories are going to become part of history. And so that makes us pretty unique, although there are some other sites. In Singapore, there's the Chinatown Heritage Center, which looks at the story of some of the immigrant community that was working in a row house and living in a row house there. I've heard rumors of a tenement museum also opening in Ireland, and there's a similar place in London's East End. And so I think there's a movement, and people are certainly interested in hearing these stories and seeing the biography of a building brought to life.
Are there things that you've learned from your job that surprised you?
I learn things that surprise me every day. And it's amazing to sort of begin to piece together history. I think, as a history major, when you begin to study history, or even I think back on grade school, everything had a, question, answer, and everything was neat and tidy. But history's messy, it's complex. And when you begin to look at the lives of these families, you begin to really tease out some of those nuances that are incredibly surprising all the time. And of course, that we share so many things in common.
I know that, one of your shorter term goals is to open up these new rooms. Long-term goals?
One of the most exciting projects we're working on now is called Your Story, Our Stories. And this is a way where we can really bring the story up to the present, so much so that we can be collecting your own family's immigration or migration experience. We've been piloting it now with schools across New York City, where students submit a story of an object. And through that object, just like we tell the stories of the families that lived in our buildings through objects, they tell the story of their family. And this is becoming such an amazing repository of what it means to be American. And
is this primarily focusing on people from New York or from all over the country?
So this is right where your question goes of the larger goals. Right now it's primarily New York, but the dream is for it to go national. And the dream is to really begin to add the kind of scholarly context and nuance to the stories that our visitors are submitting, which are part of our collection, and really give them the same kind of museum treatment so that we can understand some of these broader trends of what it means to be American.
Okay. Well, we have that to look forward to, as well as the upcoming new exhibits. Okay. We're out of time. I want to thank Miriam Bader for joining me. For information on the educational program and tours at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, you can go to its website at tenement.org. You need an appointment to visit and go back in time. For the City University of New York and One to One, I'm Cheryl McCarthy. If there are any people you'd like to hear from or topics you'd like us to explore, please let us know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.